Welcome, everyone. Bienvenue à tous. Thank you for joining us today for this International Development Research Center, International Institute for Sustainable Development, and United Nations Environment Program official side event of the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. My name is Dominique Charon, and I am the Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at Canada's International Development Research Center. Our topic today is focusing on wealth as an alternate measure of development to help us build the post-COVID recovery. At IDRC, we really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and the United Nations Environment Program, who are both long-standing partners of ours. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today, and I'll introduce them in a few minutes. I'm very honored also to be speaking to you today from Ottawa, Canada, on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. As part of Canada's foreign affairs and development efforts, Canada's International Development Research Centre champions and funds research and innovation with and alongside researchers in developing regions to drive global change. Our Strategy 2030 has a focus on bringing knowledge and solutions to bear on key challenges of our times, inequalities, climate change, and now recovering from COVID in a way that will help us achieve the SDGs. We have collaborated with IISD and UNEP over many years on a range of sustainable development challenges, and today we're delighted to engage in this conversation on measurement of wealth as a preferred indicator of sustainable and inclusive development. Before I introduce the panel, let me just say a few words to highlight the timeliness and importance of this topic on the eve of the ministerial section of this high-level political forum. There have been significant efforts to develop new means of measuring economic progress beyond the gross domestic product or GDP that we're all familiar with. And this is to address gaps in our understanding of development, particularly from an inclusion and sustainability perspective. These have been driven in part by SDG Target 17, which calls for alternate measures of progress to complement GDP, noting that GDP doesn't capture enough to be able to tell us how we're doing towards the achievement of the SDGs. This measure of GDP and other existing standard national account systems lead decision makers to favor policies with benefits in the short term, rather those that are required perhaps with benefits in the long term for sustainability. And this short term emphasis may in fact exacerbate national and global challenges, which require different ways of thinking about economic progress and require different kinds of investments today, perhaps, to achieve them. And the idea of expanded wealth measures or comprehensive wealth is this critical focus of SDG 17 and really points to the need for increased capacity of countries to use these indicators to measure progress towards sustainable development. And as countries are also now grappling with the pandemic and the pressing economic challenges that are arising from the pandemic, they're also seeing a reversal perhaps on some of the progress that they have made towards some of the SDG targets. And so finding a way to manage the recovery and to really get back on track towards the SDGs is a key dimension where these types of new measures may be helpful. This event today draws on an ongoing initiative that's looking at new ways of measuring comprehensive wealth for inclusive and sustainable development that's implemented by IISD in collaboration with the United Nations Environment Program, and that has financial support from IDRC. And the goal of the project is to develop and promote an alternative measure of progress for countries in the developing regions as a complement to conventional measures such as GDP. There are 3 partner countries: Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Trinidad and Tobago. And we'll be hearing more about that today. Now I'd like to move to our panel, but just before we do, for the audience, one or two housekeeping items. The setup of the panel this morning, today is that we'll have an introductory presentation by Rob Smith, followed by interventions of about 10 minutes each by the panelists, following which we would love to engage in a conversation with you, virtually, of course. You will have the opportunity to pose questions in the chat, and you will also have the opportunity to vote on questions that have been posed by others if you also would like that question to be answered. Those questions will be coming to me, and I will put them to the panel. If you have a specific panelist in mind for your question, please put it in your question so that we can better direct the question. And so with that, let me then turn to the introductions of the panel. We have Pushpam Kumar, who is the Chief Environmental Economist from the United Nations Environment Program. Welcome, Pushpam. We have Matthew Agarwala, who's the project leader on wealth economy for the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. And we have Aline Halima Tusadia, who is Assistant Professor, Faculty of Economics and Business at Universitas Indonesia. Welcome. And we have Robert Smith, who is a Senior Associate at IISD and Principal at Midsummer Analytics. And he has kindly agreed to kick off the conversation today with some framing remarks. So I'll happily turn it over to Robert now. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic, very much for that introduction and those words of welcome for everyone, which I would echo. Thank you to all of you for joining us today for what we hope will be an interesting and provocative discussion. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the project that Dominic referred to that has been sponsored by RDRC and is being executed by IISD. So if we could go to the first slide, please. So as Dominic mentioned, we have a project where we've partnered with experts in Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Trinidad and Tobago. And the purpose is to compile extended wealth accounts in each of these countries to explore the extent to which it's possible to develop these kinds of new wealth accounts using existing national statistics and data in those countries. To date, the efforts that have been undertaken to measure expanded wealth have mostly used international data sets. We want to find out how feasible it is to compile these accounts using national data. Because of course, if decision makers are going to make use of expanded wealth measures to guide decisions in their countries, they're going to want to know that the data have been compiled, that the measures have been compiled using their own best data. So that's the purpose of the project, and to promote this idea of using expanded wealth to measure resilience and sustainability of well-being with national decision makers. And we're very fortunate to have one of the experts from Indonesia, Aline, with us today, and she's going to speak specifically to the ways in which the project team in Indonesia is focusing on engaging decision makers there. So the next slide, please, Matt. So I wanted to talk first about what wealth is and how wealth is related to the more common concept of income. So we can think of wealth as what we possess, what we own. So it might be a car, it might be a house, it might be some savings in a bank account, it might be your skills and knowledge as a worker. All of these are things that we own, that we possess, and that have value to us because we can use them to earn income. We can think then of income as what we earn using our wealth or our assets. So we might earn a salary, we might earn savings from money in the bank, we might earn profits when we sell a house. But the important thing to understand about wealth and income is that wealth is the basis for income. So next slide, please, Matt. So if wealth is the basis for income, then wealth is what really matters in the long run. Income matters a lot today. We need to obviously have money coming into our bank accounts on a regular basis in order to live. But in the long run, it's wealth that matters. You can go without income for a little while if you have wealth to fall back on. But if you have no wealth to fall back on and you find yourself without income, then you truly are in dire straits. So both are important. Both wealth and income are important, but only wealth can be used to measure the resilience and sustainability of well-being. And that's really important to understand. Income doesn't say very much at all about resilience and sustainability. It's wealth that we need to measure to understand those concepts. So next slide, please, Matt. So where does wealth come from? Well, I mentioned a few sources of wealth a moment ago, but let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. So there's a whole bunch of types of wealth. So we can think of things like buildings and roads and factories, and these all fall under the heading of produced wealth or produced capital. Then we can think of things like healthy ecosystems and abundant natural resources. And these we put under the heading of natural capital. And then we have productive and well-educated citizens and individuals. And these we put under the heading of human capital. And then we have things like financial assets, money in the bank, or stocks and bonds that we might own. And these are called financial capital. And then finally, sort of the glue that binds all of this together are the cooperative relationships that we have amongst ourselves as individuals and groups of individuals. And that we refer to as social capital. And together, these 5 types of capital, if you like, or forms of capital, make up what we call the expanded wealth portfolio. So next slide, please, Matt. So why should we measure this wealth portfolio? Why should countries invest in developing statistics to measure the size of their wealth? Well, first and foremost, because countries today, governments today, truly don't pay enough attention to what matters in the long term. GDP and other short-term statistical measures attract most of the attention from decision makers and politicians. Everybody hears all the time about how GDP is doing, whether GDP is growing or falling. And politicians literally stake their careers on their success or failure at growing GDP in the short term. But yet citizens everywhere, in fact, depend on their wealth and not on GDP for their long-term well-being. So without wealth measures, we can't really say whether well-being today is resilient and sustainable. So we might be living well today, but unless we're measuring the wealth that is underpinning how well off we are today, then we don't know if we're going to be well off in the future. So we have to move beyond GDP and begin to measure other things. We think to begin to measure wealth if we're going to understand sustainability and the resilience of well-being. And it's not just us that is saying this. There are growing calls to move beyond GDP from all sorts of quarters. For example, when the G7 met in Canada in 2018, part of the final communique said that GDP alone is insufficient for measuring success and that we need other indicators that measure prosperity and well-being. So that's the G7 leaders saying that. That's not us saying that. So that's the prime ministers of and presidents of the most important countries in the world. So that we think is good evidence that we need to move beyond GDP. More recently, a very, very erudite and thorough exposition of the importance of biodiversity called the Review of the Economics of Biodiversity by Professor Partha Dasgupta at Cambridge University also reiterated the importance of measuring wealth as the basis of understanding sustainability. So that review, if you haven't seen it, is well worth looking at. It contains the most complete argument that I've seen to date in favor of measuring wealth. So next slide, please. So what we're really looking for, of course, is not simply to produce statistics on wealth. What we're looking for is statistics on wealth to provide an improved basis for decision making. It's not enough just to measure wealth and report on it. We have to get governments to begin to use measures on wealth to design policies that will better, much better, balance short-term and long-term objectives. Right now, there's far too much focus in our view on making sure that people are doing well in the short term and not nearly enough on ensuring that they do well in the long term. If we had wealth as a new lens on progress, decision makers would then have the tools they need to focus on resilience and sustainability of well-being in the long run and not just in the short term. Today's tools, particularly GDP, put too much emphasis on the short term. So we think it's time for balanced decision making. And in order to have balanced decision making, we need to begin to measure wealth. So next slide, please, Matt. Now, I'm going to move my comments now from that general overview to a focus on two of the five elements of the wealth portfolio. And after I'm done introducing those, we'll hand the microphone over to our colleagues who will talk about some of the other elements of the portfolio. But I'm going to talk right now about human capital and then produced capital. And then, as I say, we'll pass on to others. So when we think of human capital, what's striking about it is that it is in fact the largest element of the wealth portfolio in pretty much every country. So wherever we've made an effort to measure wealth to date, we find that human capital is the biggest portion of it. So it's particularly important that governments begin to measure human capital. And what we're talking about here is measuring the skills and the knowledge and the experience of the workforce and how that translates into their ability to earn income in the labor market. So obviously, education is fundamental to building human capital. That's really how we create human capital, is by educating people. And one of the interesting aspects of the management of the overall wealth portfolio that countries face is that it's often the case that countries will use revenues from sale of natural resources, for example, to fund education. And that's often a very good trade-off. You deplete some natural capital and you make an investment in educating your workforce and you create human capital as a result. But in order to be sure that that's a good trade-off, in order to be sure that we're not simply depleting natural capital and not succeeding in creating human capital or other forms of capital, we need to measure the overall wealth portfolio. Only by measuring wealth can we know that when we trade one form of wealth off for another, that we're actually maintaining or growing the overall size of the portfolio. Next slide, please, Matt. Now we have produced capital, and here we're talking about things like buildings and equipment and roads and things like that, all of the infrastructure that makes up the physical part of the economy. And when we think about produced capital from a comprehensive wealth perspective and a post-COVID recovery perspective, the point that we want to make here is that investment in produced capital in the post-COVID period simply cannot follow the old patterns. So we used to rely an awful lot in many countries on investment in infrastructure to extract fossil fuels. Well, that has to transition to investment in the creation of renewable energy. We're never going to solve the climate crisis if we don't. Similarly, urban sprawl can't continue. We have to change our forms of produced capital investment so that we create denser, more less land intensive cities. Private transportation, we have to stop investing in infrastructure that promotes private transportation and invest better, more in infrastructure that promotes public transport. And again, only by measuring wealth will we know if we are targeting the right investments in infrastructure to create long-term resilience and sustainability. So I'll leave it at that and hand the microphone over to my colleagues who, as I say, will continue explaining the other aspects of the portfolio and so on. So back to you, Dominique.
Thanks very much, Rob. I'm delighted to invite our panelists now to engage in how this tool can be applied in ways that are advancing our common goals of good COVID recovery, but also those SDGs. Pushpam Kumar, Chief Environmental Economist for the United Nations Environment Programme. What's your perspective on this?
Thank you, Dominic, and thanks, colleagues. My dear Excellencies, fellow traveler who have keen interest in this area, Rob has already explained very nicely that why the post-pandemic era, the economy and their measurement has to be slightly different from the business as usual. And a little bit from the natural capital lens, that how in the post-pandemic or the recovery, the only way out, I'm giving a very bold statement, only way out is the green recovery where natural capital is in the center. And that is what I'm going to do in 10 minutes time. Can we go to the next slide, please? So let's see, we are in most of the world is still in pandemic. And many of you also know that we need around 14 to 15 trillion dollars for the recovery. Now, the world is not the same. Why this upheavals has happened? This has happened partly because we have not managed, monitored, and probably not accounted our natural capital properly. Let's try to see some of the basic facts, which are not very far from what we are going to discuss, but I will come to that in a minute. An estimated 73% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic in nature. That means unwanted pathogens coming from wild to the humans. Second, zoonotic disease comprise around 1/4 of the burden of infectious disease in low-income countries. Though these two facts we must remember. Next slide, please. Yep. So whether it is developing countries where 1/4 of the infectious disease are zoonotic in nature, or globally, chunk of the diseases are zoonotic, where the unwanted pathogens are traveling from wild to the humans. They have been primarily caused by land use change, whether it is deforestation or vanishing of the water bodies. There are data coming from IPBES that land use change has caused of the new diseases since 1960. Shrinking biodiversity, we all know a magic number that around 1 species are under the risk of extinction. And the shrinking biodiversity basically impairs the efficiency and resilience of ecosystem. A climate change, very obvious case. this has also caused this pandemic. Illegal trade of wildlife, of course, unsustainable consumption, whether it is bushmeat or production, which is causing habitat fragmentation, domestication of the wild. All these things are, in a way, part of natural capital. Some of them are renewable, some of them are non-renewable. Now, if we really want a recovery, can we think of ignoring these aspects? Certainly not. And please remember that this COVID-19 is not the first one. It will never be the last one. We had early warnings, but probably we never paid attention to. GCO, Ebola, MERS, SARS, you name it, they have been happening. They have been warning, but on earlier occasions, we were lucky. This time, we were not. So the mandate is we must manage our natural capital, especially biodiversity and ecosystem properly. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So natural capital needs to be better managed across the board, but better management cannot be achieved without better monitoring and accounting. We have now much better accounting system, which is called SIA ecosystem accounts, which was approved by the Secretary General 11th of March this year. So that is a big change. And this does talk about measuring wealth in a big way. I mean, natural capital and the wealth. Then also we have to remember that putting growth for the sake of growth, measuring through GDP, we need to measure flow, no doubt about it. But measuring the progress and sustainability with the help of GDP is a problem. So that is where I think Rob has already explained. We need to measure wealth, and probably inclusive wealth or comprehensive wealth, taking everything, whether it is produce, natural, human, social. We need to have a tracking system for all types of capital. Can we go to the next slide, please? And that's why UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, since 2012 at least, have been keeping track of the wealth. Of course, the number of countries have increased. The latest was 2018, where we have measured inclusive wealth for those 140 countries. But before that, in 2014, and prior to that, 2012. So now the next will be the 2022 report for 150 plus countries measuring all kind of capitals. Can we go to the next, please? And what the latest inclusive wealth report suggests, that even if we are going high on produced and human capital per capita, on the basis of natural capital, at least for the period for which the data is available from 1992 to 2013-14, it is on decline. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what kind of natural capital we are referring to? If we see the latest report in the top 20 countries, this is the estimate which have been done. The purpose of this slide is just to give you the idea that natural capital can be measured, can be quantified, and monetized too. You want data, it is available. Can we go to the next, please? But there are some interesting findings coming from this latest inclusive wealth, and especially from natural capital data, that many of the countries are consuming beyond our means. And that is what Rob was trying to drive the point, that relying on income alone may be a bad idea. And if we really want to keep track of sustainability, we have to think about inclusive, comprehensive wealth. So because the latest data has told us that a large number of countries, in fact, only 58 out of 140 countries experienced positive growth in wealth. The rest had negative or zero growth rate. Can we go to the next, please? Many countries have started doing it, implementing it. And supplement GDP to basically keep track of where their economy is growing. And when they do this, natural capital has a big role to play. The latest was last month when Pakistan launched its Inclusive Wealth Report, which was, of course, inaugurated by the Prime Minister. And many of you might know they have a 10 billion tsunami tree program. And that restoration program has really the natural capital in the country. At least they have halted the declining trend in natural capital, which was continuing since 1990 until 2018. But since then, it has gone up. And there are many countries, some of the countries where IISD is working, and there are some other countries where other agencies are working. But the good news is a large number of countries are very receptive to implement inclusive wealth, comprehensive wealth as a measure of sustainability. This was just one example, from Pakistan. Can we go to the next and probably the last slide? Yeah. So what I'm trying to say as conclusion, number one, we no longer can consider ecological, economic, and human health as isolated issues. So if the planetary health is in a bad shape, human health will be in a bad shape, and sustainability will be in danger. Second, One Health approach really requires integration, and integration can only give you a credible estimate of natural capital. Third, One Health and natural capital accounting synergize with other sustainable development framework, such as circular economy, nature-based solution, land degradation neutrality, and many other objectives of sustainable development goals. And finally, if we really want to bolster economic recovery or green recovery or build forward better, then conservation of ecological resilience is needed, and the recovery must be judged through inclusive wealth, not GDP alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pushpam, and a great case for the importance of natural capital in this. So we're going to go now to Matthew Agarwala, who is from the University of Cambridge, the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, and we're going to talk about social capital, Matthew. So tell us how this fits into our new thinking about, or perhaps not that new, but this thinking on how focusing on wealth can help us take a longer term view on sustainable development and help us climb out of the pandemic.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here speaking alongside some of the world's foremost minds on the wealth economy and on developing actual tangible measures of wealth that we can use to fuel our recovery from the pandemic and sustainable development long into the future. My name is Matthew Agarwala. I'm at the Bennett Institute at Cambridge, and I get to speak to you today about social capital. Social capital is, of all of the components of wealth, probably the one that you are least comfortable with, least familiar with thinking about it in terms of capital and assets and economics. But it is also, and I can almost guarantee you this, the component of wealth with which you are most familiar in your day-to-day life. And it's because it impacts and it pervades everything that we do as people in our societies. So if I could have the next slide, I'm going to explain to you what I'm going to go through over the next couple of minutes. It's going to be a whirlwind tour. The world of social capital research is big. It's a broad concept. I'll try and give you some definitions so that we can fix some ideas and then get into the nitty-gritty of some of the measurements. I'm going to try and convince you that social capital is crucial for all economic outcomes. I'm going to try and convince you that the measures that we have, imperfect though they may be, do in fact correlate well with the things we would want them to correlate with. And we can actually use this to build conclusions about how we can organize an economy going forward. And I'm going to give you some case studies about how social capital plays out during times of war, during times of pandemics, and during times of economic crisis. And then what I'm hoping is that we can talk about how do we build it going forward. So if I could have the next slide, please. Social capital is one of these things that's very difficult to define. It's a broad concept. Broadly, I think it refers to the shared social norms that we have, the degree of trust that we have in other people and in our governments. It's at its simplest level, it's the ability of communities to overcome collective action problems. Now, those are all things that we can understand, but they're very difficult for us to measure. And the reason for this is that it's a latent concept. There's no obvious metric. We wouldn't think of kilograms of social capital. We wouldn't think of meters of social capital. But we deal with these kinds of difficult to define things all the time, difficult to measure things all the time. Even if we just talked about the size of a person, well, there's no clear metric for that. Are we talking about the weight, the height, the width? But we can still say and derive conclusions when we talk about a big person versus a small person. Well, social capital is one of these latent variables. We can describe it in terms that are useful to us. And so here are some of the things that we would think about it. There's an element of social capital that is unique to the individual. It's our personal relationships. It's our network. It's the degree of trust that we have in other people. But then there's also a collective bit of social capital, which is not just ourselves, but it refers to the quality of the networks that we could tap into. It refers to our ability to engage in civic life and in political topics and in our own self-governance. And it's that shared sense of community that we have. And I'm going to try and convince you that all of this is crucially important to economic transactions. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about whether or not it's really capital. So if I could have the next slide, please. There is a question amongst economists. Does this stuff, yes, trust is important. Yes, social cohesion is important, but is this really a capital asset? Well, I submit to you that it does exhibit many wealth-like characteristics. We can use a shared sense of community and trust that we have amongst individuals to generate flows of future benefits. I know that my life is better if I live in a trusting community. I'll move and pay more to move to a place that has a trusting neighborhood. We know that we can invest in social capital. We can invest in communities, but we can also degrade the trust that we have when we behave sort of suspiciously, when we do not follow our word, when government officials break the rules that they impose on the rest of us throughout the pandemic. But we also know that this stuff can persist over time. We can have a shared sense of community. I'm in the UK. It's a particularly difficult time today because the entire country has suffered a terrible loss last evening. Although, due congratulations to those of you joining us from Italy. So there are some things that really do persist over time. For the UK, the pain of football is over half a century now. But like I say, with social capital, there's no standard unit of measurement, so it's difficult to quantify. There's another question as to whether social capital is something that acts in the wealth paradigm as its own asset, or whether it's just a scaling factor that increases or decreases what we're able to do with all of the other assets. If I could have the next slide, please. But there are several reasons why we think it's important specifically to economic outcomes. The first is that if we have high social capital, we can avoid wasting money on things like defensive expenditures. If I trust that when I leave my home, it will be safe for the day while I'm away at work, then I don't have to hire a security guard. I don't have to pay for an expensive alarm system. If I cannot trust these things, then I'm going to have to waste resources on these defensive expenditures. We know that in business, social capital can reduce transaction costs. If I know that when I enter into an economic contract with another company, they're going to honor it, and if they don't, I know that there's a recourse mechanism where I can take them to court, then I can reduce the transaction costs. Otherwise, I have to spend a huge amount of money protecting myself. I will maybe forego potential economic exchanges because I'm unsure as to whether or not I'll actually be paid for the work. And even beyond just pure market outcomes, we see in numerous studies that people are actually more cooperative than we would expect them to be if they were just acting out of pure self-interest. And that suggests to me that we derive direct utility. It underpins our well-being. We're happier if we live in a trustworthy, supportive, and connected society. So this isn't just a capital asset for production for businesses. It's a private consumption good for me. If I could have the next slide, please. When we try to measure social capital, there are loads of things that could be included. How much do I belong in my neighborhood? Do I trust other people? Do I trust the police, the government? And all of the different metrics that we have from all of the different countries correlate very strongly with a simple question. Do you agree that most people can be trusted? And the answers could be yes, most people can be trusted. I don't know, or you can't be too careful. When we ask that question to people all over the world, the map that you see before you is the answer that you get. And so you see that we have broad coverage, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, East and West, rich countries and poor countries. The data is there for most countries. And it impacts our pandemic response, our productivity, and our political stability. If I could have the next slide, please. When we think about social capital, we can actually measure there's two real core components. One is that generalized trust figure, which I've just shown you on the map. But there's another component, which explains about 15% of the variation in trust scores across countries. And that distinguishes between those who place relatively more of their trust in people versus those who place more of their trust in institutions. So if I could have the next slide, please. When we look at the social capital statistics across the European Union, we see some fairly interesting trends. For instance, if we, on the left-hand side, split across different age groups, we see that relatively young people, compared to the average, have a higher general trust in other people. But on the right-hand side, what we see is that that trust in others is pretty clearly ordered, ranked based on your income quintile. So people on lower incomes have a life experience that leads them to have lower trust. And when we start thinking about these things, we can start understanding how we can build an economic strategy going forward. So I think that's my time. So I'll stop there. There are a couple of other slides that I can return to if we need them in the discussion.
Thanks very much, Matthew, and fascinating. I'm not even doing my job as a timekeeper as I was diving into your data there. So I look forward to building on this fabulous introduction to the social pillar, I guess the social capital dimension of wealth. I'd like to move now to Aline Halimatusadia, who's assistant professor of the Faculty of Economics and Business at Universitas Indonesia, and she's going to give us the country perspective on the post-COVID recovery and this idea of building back stronger and better with the Sustainable Development Goals in mind, and how wealth and the concepts of wealth can be useful in that. So Aline, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. Thanks for your kind introduction. Thanks for inviting me, sharing my thoughts on inclusive wealth from the perspective of developing world, taking the case of Indonesia. I would like to relate the discussion of inclusive wealth with our current situation, where the pandemic hits the economy, and with this disruption, we need to restart again our development mindset, particularly in developing world, where there are so many limitations in the instrument and option for wealth enrichment. Next, please. In this short presentation, I would like to address 4 things. First is how the pandemic decreased our capital. The second and third, I want to highlight the narratives that we can offer to encourage wealth enrichment in the post-COVID era, including some consideration regarding complementarities and trade-offs in wealth accumulation. And the last one is quite technical because we are trying to calculate inclusive wealth for Indonesia. I want to address some points that barrier us to produce a reliable and useful indicators and calculation of inclusive wealth for our country. Next slide, please. So as many countries experiencing now, the pandemic hits the economy and it affects the produce capital accumulation, including in Indonesia. So investment goes down as expected. But if we look at the decomposition based on the type of capital in the past, we are more concerned on to invest in building and construction sectors rather than other type of capital that are likely to be more productive, such as equipment and machinery. This can explain the phenomena of the industrialization in Indonesia, where we see decreasing productivity from industrial sectors, and it cannot be separated from the quality of labor force in our country. So if we look at the trend of capital stock during the 1998 Asian crisis, we can see that the ability of Indonesia to accumulate capital is lesser than in normal condition. The situation might repeat again during the current crisis. However, as we understand the capital in more comprehensive way, now we can pay attention not only investing in produce capital, but also to other type of capital which could be more impacted by the pandemic. Next slide, please. So Indonesian economy relies heavily on commodity product for its economy, particularly coal and palm oil. Although from the coal reserve status, we rank 7th in the world, but we are the runner-up for the global production. So we heavily rely on this commodity for export, and combined with the palm oil, from these 2 products alone, comprise almost 40% of Indonesia export. Mining and plantation can be considered as 2 sectors that drive deforestation in Indonesia. For the last decade, we lost more than 3.5 million hectares of forest. Degradation of the environment also happened for the water resource. One of the rivers in Indonesia recorded as the most polluted river in the world. Water stress level in Indonesia is the highest compared to neighboring countries in ASEAN. Next, please. Yeah. From the human capital side, the pandemic has increased the poverty rate in Indonesia. Although the increase is less than 1 percentage point, the number is quite large because Indonesia is the 4th most populous country in the world. If we increase the standard to not only poverty, but also vulnerable people, the figure will be much higher. Inequality also become an issue. In Indonesia, the Gini ratio increased over the last few decades. And even though the Gini ratio is better for the last few years, the pandemic increased the ratio again. As we know, the informal sector in Indonesia is dominant. And as the pandemic hits the informal sector workers, they might have to sell their asset. On the other hand, the formal sectors that do not affected by the pandemic has the opportunity to increase their asset because their expenditure of tertiary goods decrease, for example, for holiday. This could worsen the inequality for asset holding at the individual level. Indonesia has problem also in the education issue. Although the enrollment rate increased over time, but it's still far if we look at the quality of the education. For example, the PISA score of Indonesia ranked 71 out of 77 globally. A study shows that those who switch from informal to formal sector relatively not experiencing an increase in their wage. What does it reflect? This reflects a low productivity in the manufacturing sectors, and it will hinder our effort to switch to industrialized country. Because of diversity in the quantity and the quality of ICT infrastructure in Indonesia, online learning that still happen now make access to student to learning process is not the same. In many remote areas, we see schools are closed completely without conducting any online learning. A study by the World Bank estimate that for every additional year of schooling, it will generate 8% of additional earning. So we can imagine the cost that we have as many schools completely closed from the very beginning of the pandemic until now. And the last one that is quite shocking is the impact of the pandemic to the underage marriage case that increased for more than 2 times. Next slide, please. So in the developing world, depends on the interest of each country maybe, yeah, tend to have a myopic view, particularly in the current situation where we must do so many things to respond to COVID, but we have limited resource in terms of health infrastructure capacity or to finance health or to support impacted people and other things. So we have to find a strong argument to make countries feel the importance of conserving and enriching the capital and avoiding more depletion on all capital that we have today. I have listed some arguments. The first argument is that to be able to produce something and getting income from the production, we need asset. The capital that we need is not only produce capital, but all kind of capital as they are all income generating. The second is that we might have a short-term loss, but investing in national wealth will create long-term gain. Next one is the importance of gaining double dividend from our investment, like investing in conservation at the same time, take out the poverty by promoting, for example, through social forestry program. We also need to consider about investment prioritization. We need to allocate investment to more productive, long-term and more resilient capital. We also need to put more consideration on the complementarity among different capital to avoid idle capital. Some of the infrastructure that has been built in Indonesia, for example, like road in eastern part of Indonesia, has very low utilization because we don't employ or enhance other capital, such as human capital. The last one is that we need to avoid the trade-offs between capital, like the operation of business activity has to minimize risk to in the environment and social. The framework is already there. For example, the framework introduced by IFC regarding 8 performance standard. Next slide, please. So infrastructure development becomes one of the strategic program in Jokowi presidency because we have underinvestment in infrastructure for about 2 decades. However, if we evaluate how the government prioritize what kind of infrastructure that must be built, is not fit, yeah, to the inclusive wealth mindset. That is why we recommend the government to focusing the infrastructure project so it has more impact to the wealth enrichment and have a long-term impact. As an example, we need to invest more in ICT infrastructure for equitable education and also promoting local economic growth. We also need climate and disaster resilient infrastructure, as well as infrastructure to mitigate disaster, because we don't want to have double burden. Yeah. So the COVID and the disaster at the same time. Next slide, please. In calculating the inclusive wealth for Indonesia, we face some challenges. First is about data. Yeah. We have difficulties in getting detailed data such as investment by sectors or by type or by region or the mix of the three. Yeah. The second one is no estimation on the depreciation rate for each type of capital. We know that the lifetime of each capital is different, and having a single depreciation rate can be misleading. The third one is we have difficulties on estimating resource rent for natural capital. In constructing this parameter, we need data also on the depreciation and the cost of production, as well as the revenue for each type of natural capital. And the last one is the indicator for social capital. I think it is important to develop a common indicator that derive from a strong concept of social capital, so we can compare this indicator across region or countries. Yeah. And the key message is that looking at the problem that we face, we think statistic authority need to catch up with evolving development concept. Next slide, last slide. Yeah. National Development Planning Agency of for free, yeah, through this link. Okay, sorry.
No, thank you, Aline. You froze just as the slide changed, so I wondered if we'd lost you, but you're there, so that's wonderful, and thank you very much for that, and for that slide. That's going to be useful. It's really interesting to hear from a country perspective on actually putting these tools into use, and really helpful, but also daunting to hear the kinds of challenges and trade-offs that there are in grappling with these questions. And some of our questions are pointing to that. So thank you first to all of our panelists for the great setup to the conversation here. And I'm delighted to say that we have some questions. So I'm going to start with one. I think this one is for Pushpam. What are your thoughts on the linkages between inequality and the natural capital kind of problem, as the ecosystems that are perhaps most degraded, the natural capital that is most depleted, is often linked with people's socioeconomic struggles, and those people may be in vulnerable groups who face significant inequality, and yet these degraded ecosystems also threaten their health, livelihood, and well-being. So as we have the degraded ecosystems threatening their health, but also the trade-offs that they may be making on a daily basis that further degrades ecosystems as they deal with less access and opportunity than others.
So that's a tough one. But one of the work which we are right now we are doing is trying to address exactly this kind of question, that if we bring natural capital into the measurement of wealth, how or what kind of new insights we might have on prevalence of inequality, basically economic inequality. So how inequality is measured? It is either Gini coefficient, which Aline was referring to, or 2020, the ratio. Now, what we find that if we bring natural capital as the part of public wealth, that is how Thomas, Piketty and World Data Lab and many other, colleagues, even social indicators, they are also measuring the same way. Then I think declining natural capital would tell you that the prevalence of inequality is much more pronounced than otherwise. So it is critically important that in the post-pandemic recovery plan, in order to capture the growth in inequality, we bring natural capital and inclusive wealth. Why? Because as Secretary General again always says that due to this pandemic, we have lost 20 years. The prevalence of poverty and inequality has gone back to 99 level. So virtually what we achieved in last 20 years has come back to zero. So we have to emphasize poverty reduction and alleviation of inequality in a more effective way. And if we really want to keep track of that progress, we have to bring natural capital and wealth in the center. Then probably we can keep track of those unwanted social phenomena, that is poverty and inequality, much better. But once again, I reiterate that if we bring natural capital into inequality measurement, then we will have a new insights which is not available otherwise. Thanks.
Apologies, lost my mouse. Thank you very much, Pushpam. And I think we'll come back to this. There are a few other questions around the map in particular that stimulated some questions in the section, the question and answer section. But I'm going to pose another one here because I think it's very interesting and speaks to something I wondered about as well. We see that there are real limits to a solely produced capital vision, or a, what we would think of as a GDP-like measurement of progress. How much traction, and we see obviously from Indonesia, there is traction. We know from your work in Ethiopia and in the Caribbean also that there is traction to think of it differently. We see it in the SDGs, but is there really uptake of morally and philosophically of thinking about progress and measuring progress in a different way that would speak more to wealth? And maybe I'll put that question first to Rob and then perhaps Matthew.
Thanks, Dominique, and thank you to all of the participants for their questions. I mean, part of the objective of this project is indeed to increase the uptake of these kinds of measures. So statisticians and economists for a long time now have understood what needs to be measured in terms of wealth. So it's no longer a question of what should we be measuring. We know how to measure it. We don't have the data in all cases, but that's a tractable problem. We can collect the data that we need. But what we really need is to create the demand for these kinds of measures. And that's what this project is about. It's about trying to engage with decision makers in countries to show them the value of compiling expanded wealth accounts and to show them how the availability of those accounts would lead them to different kind of decision making that was more focused on, more balanced, as I said in my introductory remarks, between the present and the future. And there is really a strong moral dimension there. The future cannot speak on its own behalf, obviously. And so we today have, I believe, a moral obligation to consider the well-being of those who are yet to come in our decision making. It's an eminently selfish position to be concerned only with one's own short-term well-being. The morally, I think, appropriate position is to say that, yes, my own short-term well-being is important, but the well-being of those to come is important as well. And somehow or other, we need to balance that. And unless you're measuring wealth, you really are missing a key statistical element in your toolkit in order to make that kind of balanced decision. So there is a moral dimension to it for sure.
Yeah, and well, thanks for that. And it's exciting to think that as we move into a discourse as we re-engage in a discourse of sustainable development, but we are still in this recovery period, we can expect that there will be real pressures to focus on short-term economic gain. So, that all the more importance to engage in these conversations of yes, now and later. Livia has a question, perhaps, Matthew, that I can put to you because it builds a bit on this conversation. I bet there aren't generalizable 3 or 4 the key impactful things that we can do now that are going to be politically relevant now that can be done in all countries to move us to improve wealth. But perhaps I'm wrong there, and there are some universal things that could be done now. But maybe you can add on to what Rob has said and maybe tackle Livia's question while we're at it.
Sure, that's a great question. Thanks, Livia. There is an appetite for going beyond GDP. And we've seen this. This is why we developed the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals before then. We wanted something different. We knew that GDP wasn't getting us there on its own. And we see that governments are starting to take this up. The Scottish government has a well-being economy strategy, which includes natural capital, social capital, human capital, and physical capital. There's a wealth accounting framework that's being developed by the United Nations and one by the World Bank. Natural capital accounting guidelines have just been released in March of this year for all countries to follow. And there are already countries using them. So there is an appetite for this. You're right to point out that there is not a single obvious, clear investment that all countries should prioritize at the very top, perhaps. The closest that I could suggest, though, is to look deeply into what's going on in natural capital. Because of all of the components of wealth, natural capital is the only one that is in sustained worldwide decline and has been for decades. And the economic consequences of that are coming home to roost now. As Pushpam eloquently set out, it's the driver behind this pandemic. So focusing on natural capital. But that's going to differ depending on where in the world you are. How do you start investing in natural capital? In some places, this is going to be managing your fisheries and your coastal ecosystems more sustainably. In other countries, it's going to be rapid decarbonization of the energy and transportation system. In others, it's going to be combating deforestation. And in others still, it's going to be dealing with our diets and the way that we produce food. So this will differ across countries. But I would say one of the things, we can start with natural capital. The other thing that all countries need to do is start investing in the statistical infrastructure. We talk about produced capital, we talk about human capital and skills and knowledge. There's an infrastructure behind national accounts, behind statistics, of gathering the data, organizing it, and then communicating it. And that's hugely important. This year, we've learned just how important data is to getting decisions right in government. We need to invest in the statistical infrastructure. And the final thing that I would give you is that it's got to go way beyond governments. If wealth accounts are just created by governments for governments, they have missed their mark. The media needs to speak about it. When we report on the economy, it should be we report on the environmental economy. The two cannot be distinguished. We have to report on wealth, not just GDP. So that's the media, the newspapers, and it's all of us when we have conversations about the economy.
Thanks so much, Matthew, and almost probably provoking more questions here, but I'm going to go to Aline because you are, in fact, speaking to us from a country that is gripped with these very questions and thinking about wealth, but thinking also in the context of the recovery from the pandemic. What do you see as you mentioned some of those trade-offs between the investment that's going to be needed in education, the investment that's going to be needed in addressing early marriage and young pregnancies. And these are going to have long-term impacts. I'd be interested to hear more from you on this immediate sort of 3 to 4 year time frame that we're looking at, and a gender perspective as well. You know, how are these playing out in Indonesia?
Yeah, thank you, Dominic. So it is quite hard to make the government buy in this long-term view idea, yeah, looking at this political cycle. But actually we have some kind of safeguard. We have a long-term development plan, like 25 years, and we can put our effort there. So we put target that accommodate the whole perspective of this comprehensive dimension of capital. Yeah, so this is our safeguard, even though we know from the political elite, maybe the strategy is not, yeah, but we can offer them to have like some kind of short-term milestone. Yeah, for example, like green economy. Yeah, green economy to be implemented in developing countries like Indonesia is quite expensive actually. Yeah, but we can offer them some kind of like co-benefit or double dividend. The argument is like value added creation, job creation, some kind of that thing. So we have to try to figure out like what kind of the best composition, yeah, to make this transition toward more comprehensive comprehensive dimension. And then yeah, so we in Indonesia we have, I think, two issues, yeah, two important issues: the natural capital and human capital, yeah. And as we know, these two wealth indicators is important, but also to buy in this idea, someone has to have like long-term view, particularly like human capital. Yeah, like if we look at the quality of education or underage marriage, yeah, not many people knows the effect of that things. Yeah, so how to make the policymakers and people understand the impact, the long-term impact of that thing. Yeah. Like also stunting and others. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is, and I'm seeing many questions now coming forward saying, aha, there are trade-offs. Yes, it's not possible, I think, to advance in any context all of these things without some trade-offs. If we're protecting the environment, then that may come at a short-term cost to productive capital. There may be great long-term benefits. Investments in education now may not pay off until quite a bit later, and it's the tools for measuring and evaluating these options are important, but the governance for deciding those choices is also really important. And perhaps we can come to this now. I have a couple of groups of questions here in the time we have. We still have a good amount of time. We have a set of questions that are pointing to the fact that the countries that were doing well on natural capital and on trust may in fact have done that by historically exploiting other countries quite badly and exploiting certain populations quite badly. Is it the path forward for preserving natural capital clearly has to be different, perhaps, than the path forward in for some countries in the past. And I may be garbling these questions terribly, but I'm trying to combine some things here. I wonder if we could talk. So let me just pull a couple of these specific questions. So the stock of wealth, particularly in the green countries, in your map, it was Matthew's map, is this correct? Is due to the historical transfers of wealth, and this underpins the current global economy. Will the measurements of wealth going forward take into account the need to not have that kind of exploitation of other countries in order to advance one's own wealth? And the question that I had from Ariane Dahan that was from Adiha Ahmed and at IDRC, and also from IDRC from Ariane. The trust countries, the countries with high trust also seem to be high greenhouse gas emitters. So we see this combination of high economic status, good governance, or stronger institutions, higher trust, but also high emissions. And is this a problem that we can't get away from, or can we move into something different by measuring wealth? Hopefully I haven't garbled that too badly and created an interesting conversation going forward. And maybe I'll come back to Pushpam first, and then back to Matthew, and finish with Robert.
So thank you very much. Rob, in his remark, mentioned about the Dasgupta review, and that review which has been done for the UK's Treasury, and now there has been a formal response from the government. They reiterate again and again that humans are embedded in nature. And so that point we have to remember. Now, if historically we have been appropriating the nature or mining or minerals or forestry or topsoil or fishery or coastal resources, and then we have attained a certain level of produced capital or material comfort, that does not mean that by that we have to continue this, or if we stop appropriating natural capital, then probably we will become poorer, or it will be more unequal society. Issue is not that. If we think about the sustainability for maximum number of people, then I think we need to manage natural capital better. That means we need to monitor and account them. That can be done through the wealth measurement framework. Second, it is inevitable, and the data shows, even from Inclusive Wealth Report for many countries, that there could be a trade-off that in some countries, and which is not very hard to understand, because you can destroy the topsoil, cut the forestry, deplete the fisher stock, and probably can make better schools or colleges or hospitals or probably better buildings. Okay, but as IMF executive director all the time says, that if having a good income or material comfort is just like having a nice house with nice painting, suited in a nice suit people, but the foundation of the house is full of sand, which can collapse anytime. And we have to remember that for a certain range only, the produced capital can substitute natural capital, not forever. And it is not, I'm not trying to raise the Malthusian ghost or limit to growth theorems or J. Forrester's work. No, the issue is that this limit would apply, and it has already started applying. I mean, in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, there are plenty of examples. Third, there are cases where there are global public goods. So the benefits of Congo forest, DRC Congo, or Indonesian forest is appropriated by the global, people, or the seabed carbon in the ocean or the sea is owned by somebody, appropriated by somebody else. There is a need for global institution to regulate the pricing, reflect the pricing, and all those things can be done once we have a baseline, basic wealth measurement in place as a supplement to GDP, and a lot of questions can be answered. I'm not saying all the questions of inequality and poverty would be addressed by having wealth, but we can do much better than what we are doing, now.
Indeed.
Thanks.
Thanks, Pushpam. And Matthew, I think we are hearing it's not either natural capital or social and human capital. It has to be both. And it's navigating those changes in a way that does not leave people behind. It may be difficult and its change is hard, but it is possible to do it in a way that mitigates some of the negatives. Perhaps you can comment a bit on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. There is a danger when people first start thinking about the wealth economy approach, the inclusive wealth measurement, that we just start thinking, okay, well, as long as we create a whole load of some physical capital and a whole load of some human capital and a whole bunch of some social stuff, then job's done. And that's not the best way to think about this framework. The way to think about it is to search for the synergies that exist between the capitals, because that's where your public investments can start yielding the highest possible return, the greatest value for money for people. So when you are building transport infrastructure, don't just think about how many passengers can I get from A to B. Think about what's going to be the effect on carbon emissions as well. And crucially, what's going to be the effect on air pollution, PM10 and PM2.5, because that affects human health, which has a human cost, but also has a labor productivity cost. And so then what we have is a link from physical infrastructure, your transport network, straight through to natural capital, straight through to human capital, straight through to quality of life. And that's where we need to start looking for the synergies and thinking about investments across the portfolio of assets. But there will also be some trade-offs. And so there will be some people in a transition who may find that their old career as a petroleum engineer may no longer be useful. And for those people, we need to rely on the social and institutional capital, on the governance systems, that we can retrain them and provide a safety net so that they can continue to be productive members of the economy. So there are going to be challenges. But what wealth accounting can do is help us understand and anticipate where those challenges might be so that we can address them deliberately and strategically, rather than put out fires when they arise because we didn't look forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Rob, I'm handing the floor back to you to add to this. I think we've covered, I'm very pleased we've covered most of the ground on the questions, but I'm sure you have a perspective on this. There's some specific technical questions maybe we can come back to separately after the panel to the people who asked them. But Rob, over to you.
Great, thanks, Dominique. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the way that the conversation has gone with this focus on equality, and it's not surprising, I think, given the world that we live in today. And I think it's really fundamental to understand that inequality is essentially a matter of differential access to assets. So at its root, inequality is the result of not all of us having equal access to different sets of assets. We're all born with a certain degree of human capital that we have the potential to use, but we aren't all given access to the produced capital that we need to realize the potential of our human capital. All countries have some degree of natural capital, but they don't all have the same social capital assets that allow them to make effective use of their natural capital. So inequality in many ways is a matter of unequal access to assets. I think we focused for a long time on equality of income, which is clearly important, but it's really just a single dimension in the equality debate. We think that the inequality debate and many other elements of public policy would benefit tremendously if governments had this new lens through which they could regard the development of their economies and their societies, this lens called comprehensive or inclusive wealth. So I think that's the final word that I'd like to leave people with is that we need to encourage more decision makers. We need to explain to more decision makers why wealth matters, why it's not just income that matters. And we need to convince them to begin thinking, as Matthew has said, about the win-wins, and as Aline said about the double dividends and so on. We would all be a lot better off, both today and in the future, if we did that. So I'll leave it with at that to Dominique, and I'd like to just express my thanks to you and to my co-panelists for what I found to be a tremendously stimulating discussion. And thanks, of course, to everyone who joined us.
Well, thank you. And thanks. I'll add my thanks to yours, Rob. So thank you to our virtual audience. Really, thanks to your engagement as well in the question and answer session. Great questions. Thanks to the panelists for taking the time to have this conversation with us today. I know that the session is recorded. It will be accessible for those who couldn't be here with us today. And I really look forward to the conversations over the next few days of the high-level political forum to see where elements of our conversation today may be resonating and reflected in ways forward to climb out of, not only climb out of and recover from the pandemic, but build the way forward that is sustainable and inclusive, and get back on track and perhaps beyond, 2030 and our sustainable development goals. Thanks to IISD and to the United Nations Environment Programme for collaborating with us today on this panel, and thanks very much to the technical support team in the background. Wishing you all a very good day and continued engagement with this high-level political forum. Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.